Let's get into it. Eagles and Giants, football at 4. Johnny Mack on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline here on the Sports Batch Live on 97.3 ESPN. John, welcome. How are you, pal?
I'm doing well. How are you guys?
All is good. We know the Friday injury report, everybody waiting to see. I thought today was one of the oddest things ever. Yesterday we had talked about no chance for Ertz and a much better chance for Johnson, and then all of a sudden it seemed like it was flip-flopped according to some reports out there. I know a lot of people must be kind of being like, what does everybody know here? But what are your thoughts on that Ertz might have a better chance of play than Johnson now?
Yeah, I think that's the case. And
wow, because you have been very pro Lane Johnson playing.
Yeah, and we got a little bit of sort of clarification what's going on. It seems to be in a bad spot, the high ankle sprain on the inside of the foot. From that perspective, that's worse than if it's on the outside of the foot. So there's some concern from that. Lane didn't even practice today, so he actually is trending in a negative direction as far as instead of being positive. So that's number one. Number two, they've been, preparing all week like it's going to be Vaitai at right tackle, going to be Matt Pryor at right guard. And then if you cross your fingers and something happens and Lane is able to get out there, I think their thought process there is Vaitai's played enough, has enough versatility that he'll be able to handle it. But I think from the Eagles' perspective, it was their thought that if Matt Pryor was going to have to play, we need to give him as many reps as possible for a guy who hasn't played that much, and that's how they've sort of taken this and gone in that direction. From Zach, I always put that caveat on it. If he has a lacerated kidney, he cannot play. That's not changed. The question is, was the original report from NFL media, was that correct? Is it a lacerated kidney or a bruised kidney? There's at least some hope. I find it very hard to believe that the Eagles don't know at this point. But Doug claims they're going to have tests tomorrow, Saturday. And if they're good, he's going to play. If they're not, he's not going to play. So I'm kind of surprised that's still up in the air. Maybe a little gamesmanship there. But they're optimistic that Zach might be able to play, and that indicates a bruised kidney rather than a lacerated kidney.
See, John, I wonder now about the original test results on Zach's kidney and how it was read and the type of test, because I do remember several years ago, Michael Vick, the team thought he had broken his hand because of how the original test looked on the original X-ray, but then when they took the more advanced X-rays later in the week, whether it's an MRI or something differently, I don't know, they discovered that what they saw was just inflammation and not a break. And maybe now I'm wondering if these tests that they're waiting on now are a little bit more advanced imaging type tests, and they'll get to determine better on what they, like their original look at it, everything that they kind of saw led them to believe it was a laceration, but now maybe they're seeing it, it's just a bruise, or it could be just a bruise.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to lean on a Dougism here and say I'm not a doctor, number one. Mm-hmm. But I do find it, how it was it explained to me at the original, at the beginning of all this, and how Zach was able to get back on the field when he potentially had a lacerated kidney. The explanation was, well, in stadium, you don't have the ability to do those kinds of tests. So maybe you think it's just a broken rib and he's got some pain. And then the further test showed that it was a laceration along with the blood in the urine. So that was the original explanation. So again, just from the timing standpoint, remember Zach didn't play in week 17. Why were these tests not done?
Right.
Why weren't these better tests, these more clearly defined tests, not done? They had to be done. And that's where I think the gamesmanship goes into it. So my only point is I don't think the Eagles are waiting on Saturday an extra test. I think they're trying to stretch this out as long as possible. And they already know whether he's got a bruised or a lacerated kidney, and they're just for whatever reason. I think it's overrated, but they're using that as competitive advantage and trying to hold their cards close to their vest because they have to know.
And that's kind of consistent with how Doug is. You've talked about the messaging all the time and how that rankles the fans because they're led to believe one thing and then the opposite happens. So that falls just in line. I want to ask you about the offensive line, John, because if you've got Big V at right tackle and Matt Pryor at right guard, and the Seahawks, it looks like Iapati might not play for them, so they would have backups at center, left guard, and left tackle. You literally have between both teams an entire backup of offensive lines. Which one do you think is worse off because of that?
Well, definitely the Seahawks from the perspective of it's not great to begin with, and then you take some attrition there, whereas the Eagles' offensive line, as I often say, when they're healthy, it's the strength of their team, no question about it, and they lost two of their three best offensive linemen if you don't have Brandon and Lane Johnson. But you still have Jason Kelsey, you still have Jason Peters. Isaac has settled down since that early game struggle in Atlanta and played okay, pretty well. And then Vitae's played pretty well. I know people don't like him and they don't want to admit that, but he's done a solid job. So, yeah, I think that's still an advantage. But remember, it's not the Eagles' offensive line versus Seahawks' offensive line. They got to play Jadeveon Clowney, and I think that's more helpful in the fact that he's banged up and he's dealing with that core muscle injury. And as we know, players who try to play through that and give Clowney credit, he's going to play, they're not the same.
John, what's a bigger area of focus or potential concern, if at all? And I've posed this question to Mike and Moshe a few times already over the last couple of days, but Zach Ertz and the tight end position with him possibly playing with a half a kidney or not playing, and then Miles Sanders playing but not at 100%, and then how Jordan Howard's return impacts the game plan there.
Well, I think we have to see kind of, and that's going to be a game time feel with Miles Sanders, because it's not only, he said again today, and he was back at practice, and that's what he said, he would be back at practice Friday. He's going to play. There's no question about that. But you do have to realize what type of player he is and the explosion he has, and if that ankle injury affects him in any way on the field, and he's too hampered by it to be effective. So I think there's kind of two parts to Miles. From the tight end's perspective, I think even if Zach plays, it sort of flip-flops to the end of that, how it was at the end of that Cowboys game when Zach came back, and sort of Dallas becomes the tight end one, and Zach is the complement. Because even if he's out there, he's not going to be 100%. And if Miles isn't 100%, then, yeah, you need more from Jordan Howard, although he's still the third back. I mean, Boston Scott is ahead of him now because of the way he's performed.
With Aguilar ruled out officially now today for the game, just how do you see the wide receivers looking, just from 1 to 3, 1 to 4? Because we saw a new guy once again last week.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't think that matters that much because they're not going to use them. I mean,
right.
The bodies are going to be out there. And I guess it's kind of interesting. I mean, JJ's been dealing with a foot injury, and that's why he kind of took a step back from a playing standpoint. So he's been dealing with that. And then you talk about, other than Greg Ward, he's the slot guy, and we all understand that, and he's the chain mover. Then you have Rob Davis, Deontay Burnett, JJ. And the ball's not going to them. The ball's going to Ward, it's going to Goddard, it's going to Scott, it's going to Sanders, it's going to Zach if he plays. It's not going to the receivers.
Well, how much is Goddard involved? If Ertz comes back decoy wise, I mean, does Goddard? I mean, he had 12 catches the first time these two teams played. I think, and we had Brady Henderson on earlier, we had John Clayton yesterday. They both mentioned Kendrick and his impact on the first game, him not being in. How much the tight end is going to be part of the game plan for the Eagles, and how much of that is Goddard?
Yeah, I think it is, and that's what I said. I think it flip-flops. Even if Zach plays, he becomes the complement. He becomes the second tight end. Dallas has got to be the first tight end because Zach's not going to be 100%. So I do think that shifts, and he'll be a big part of the game plan, Dallas Goedert. No question about it. And the Seahawks have struggled, which is kind of surprising considering the linebackers they do have. I mean, you talk about Michael Kendricks not being able to play. He's their third best linebacker anyway. I mean, that's a team with Bobby Wagner and KJ Wright. So that's the strength of that defense, which, by the way, isn't very good anymore. So you kind of think about the Legion of Boom and what the Seahawks have been in the past. Not that defense anymore, not even close.
Yeah.
And they've had issues throughout the season dealing with any tight ends. So Dallas Goedert's got to be a big part of this game from an offensive perspective.
Well, so let me ask you then, because the last time they played, it was the one reason why I thought the Eagles had a shot to win that game is because they were at home and Seattle's defense is not very good. That day, the Eagles' offense was one of the most inept offenses we've ever seen. I mean, that was historically probably had to be one of the worst outings they ever had. So what changes this time around? Is their defense lesser? Brady Henderson said that was the best day they had all season long. That was the best defensive effort they played. And part of that is because the Eagles' offensive personnel was so bad. But is Seattle's defense coming in this time even lesser than that time?
Well, I don't know if it's lesser, as I said, with Kendricks. I mean, certainly he's a part. But, again, he's the third linebacker. Clowney's not healthy, Jadeveon Clowney. That's the player the Eagles are most concerned with. But he's been dealing with that core muscle injury. And he was here. Remember, he came to Philadelphia early when the Seahawks played here in November because he went to see Dr. William Myers, who's the go-to guy with sports hernias in the NFL. And Myers told him to get surgery. He's trying to play through it. So it's a similar situation to what we went through with Sean Jackson. Different from a defensive player's perspective. They can fight through it a little bit better than, say, a thoroughbred. But he's not the same guy. And then I think the context of that first game gets lost. I'm going to make one prediction that I guarantee is true. Carson Wentz isn't going to turn it over 4 times. The second part of it, that was the Andre Dillard game at right tackle. And that was, because of that, was the anxiety game of Brandon Brooks, where he tapped out in the first series. So they didn't have those guys, Lane Johnson and Brandon Brooks, similar to what might happen this weekend. Difference is they tried Dillard. It was a disaster. Now they've gone back to Vitae, who can at least settle things down. And now they've prepared Matt Pryor for potentially playing. So I think the Eagles are better prepared from that standpoint. So those two things trend in a better direction. And then the third part is the Eagles moved the ball in that game. And it goes back and circles back to the turnovers. They actually moved the football pretty well. They just shot themselves in the foot. Or you can argue, and from a Seahawks perspective, I'm sure that's the way they'll look at it and say we forced those turnovers, and rightfully so. That's the way they should look at it.
You know, John, there's a lot of matchups on paper to really like for the Eagles. I mean, as bad as the offense was throughout the middle of the year, we were talking earlier, they finished with a top 5 third down offense and a top 5 red zone offense and a top 10 or 11 overall offense. And we noted that Seattle finished with a bottom-ranked defense, and they were not very good. And they're one of the worst red zone defenses in the NFL. And who would have kind of thought that the way the season was shaping up for both teams, 11 weeks into the season. But that's the kind of stuff in the playoffs that always matters, like your situational football, with how you run the ball, how you play D, but situational football especially.
Yeah, no question, and that is what the Eagles are kind of hanging their hat on. They have been good in situational football, really on both sides of the ball for the most part. I do think you look at them and say, rightfully so, the talent is not there from a personnel standpoint. And then Seattle's got the trump card, and that being Russell Wilson. That's the most impactful player in this game most likely. He could go win a game on his own, and I think that's always a concern. But, I think on paper and how things have trended down the season, things look good for the Eagles. And one of the things that Doug explained is that the Eagles have had time, and actually it was Pete Carroll misspoke there. Pete Carroll explained, the Eagles have had time to integrate from these injuries. The Seahawks injuries have been so late in the season, they haven't been able to get their feet under them. So they're just going to the next man up and saying, hey, you got to do it. The Eagles have had that ramp-up period where they've been able to get Greg Ward into this offense, Boston Scott into this offense. They've been able to shift from Jordan Howard to Miles Sanders late in the season. They've gotten Carson comfortable with all these parts. Seahawks got to go out there and throw out Marshawn Lynch off the couch and Travis Homer. Hey, maybe Travis Homer is their Boston Scott, but he hasn't had 4 weeks to get comfortable in that offense. So I think that's an advantage for Philadelphia as well.
It's an interesting point. John McMullen, of course, at JF McMullen. Eagles getting ready for Seattle. You know, Seattle didn't move the ball all that well the last time either. They only scored 17 points. So are we confident that Philly has the game plan to kind of keep them in that range again?
Well, we talked about their defense at home a lot. They averaged 16 points a game at home, giving up in the Jim Schwartz era. So they were right there, 17. That's the good news. Bad news is, if you look at the context from that, remember, you had the one play where Russell Wilson never makes a mistake on, with Jacob Hollister wide open in the end zone, just wide open. Overthrew him. Nobody was around him. Easy touchdown. You had at least 2 or 3 drops from DK Metcalf. A couple of them were difficult, but he was streaking down the field en route to making big plays. So it could have been a lot worse from a defensive perspective in that game. So you look at it from both sides, and Jim talked about it and said we were close to making plays as well, and that's true. But those were eye-opening plays that looked like they were going to be touchdowns or at least big plays for the Seahawks, and they didn't make it. To expect them not to make those plays again, it's probably not going to happen. So they probably have to play a little bit better, to be honest. Yeah, the Eagles' defense.
I did try to argue the point earlier, or at least mistake the point earlier, that it feels like the Eagles, over the last 4 weeks, they have an understanding of who they are and what their limitations are, and they're able to game plan around that. And Seattle, by losing 2 of 3, 3 of 4, and then continuing to get hurt with injuries, I feel like it's worse for them because they're kind of struggling to find out now who they – I mean, their bread and butter was taken away. Their running game and their left tackle just got taken away, and that's really what they do offensively. So I kind of feel that also tilts it toward the Eagles in this scenario, just kind of discovering what you can and can't do right now.
Yeah, and that's what Pete's saying. The Eagles have had time to at least get more used to the attrition they've had. The Seahawks have not. They just kind of got to go into this blind. But you also have to point out last week's Week 17 game. They lost, but they were in that game, and they maybe should have won it. A bad referee call. They deserve to be hammered for the late delay of game penalty. You can never do that. But they were on the 1-yard line going in to win that game against arguably the most talented team in the NFC. So at least from a 1-week perspective, now they were at home. That's different. But they handled it pretty well, and especially offensively. Not early, but by the second half, they kind of figured it out. So maybe they got some confidence from that. And again, a lot of ways, I think they'll lean on Russell Wilson, and they'll point at Russell Wilson and say, you know, this is one of the – I don't think people realize, for whatever reason, this is – maybe it's the Pacific Northwest, maybe it's the West Coast. People don't pay attention. This guy wins, and he wins at a level few in this league ever have. He's the only quarterback in history to start his career with 8 straight winning seasons. Only one. This guy is a winner. And I often say wins and losses aren't a quarterback stat, and I believe that. But I'll also couch that with there are certain guys that are different. And this is one of those guys who tends to find a way to win football games.
All right, John McMullen, we've got, a lot of confidence, it seems like, from the Eagle fans all of a sudden. 4 straight. They're facing a team that's 1-3 in its last 4. A lot of injuries on both sides of the ball. So the biggest difference-making factor is what in your pick?
Biggest difference-making factor, I just said it, it's Russell Wilson. He's not going to be the MVP of this league, but he's number 2. Second part is I'm scared to death. All week I've been ready to pick the Eagles. I shifted at the last minute because everybody's picking the Eagles, and I'm concerned when that happens. And so I'm picking – it's going to be a close game either way. It's going to be a one-score game. The Seahawks have won 11 games. Their point differential is 7 points. It's amazing how many close games they play, but they usually find a way to win them, and that's because of the quarterback. And he's going to do it again. The Seahawks are going to win it 24-20.
24-20, John McMullen's pick at JF McMullen with complaints. All right. John, we got playoff football. That's all we can really ask for. Good one on Sunday, and you like Seattle. Thanks, pal.
All right, thanks, guys.
And John McMullen, go against appeared via the Boardwalk Honda Hotline.